We met David Neale yesterday in the panel. He is the Animal Welfare Director for the Animals Asia Foundation, leading a variety of welfare campaigns working towards improving the welfare of animals across Asia. Please welcome David Neale.
Thank you, and thanks to Ron, Scott, and Stephanie for inviting me to come and speak here. As you can see, I'm going to talk a little bit about our partnership working with zoos and the zoo community in China and Vietnam, but also with the zoo community here in the US and in Europe. So, firstly, just a little bit of context. Animals Asia, this is not our main focus. Animals Asia's main role is working towards ending bear farming in China and Vietnam. But this program has started in the last 6 years since I've been involved, specifically on the campaign side of things. We've had these rather broad strategic aims, but you can see the first one is very much looking at some of the entertainment practices. A second one's looking at some of the problems in terms of the import of wild-caught animals. And then the bottom two are more about the regulations and the governance. And these are the 5 key areas, and this is just how I'll structure the talk to talk about what we've done from our investigations, how we're working with zoos to improve welfare and working with vets on welfare improvements, and then some of our public awareness and government works. From an investigations point of view, many of you will have seen some of this before, but this is the kind of thing which we see on a regular basis in the safari parks and in some of the zoos in China and also in Vietnam. These are tigers and lions which have obviously had their teeth removed to be used in circus tricks, bears on motorbikes, bears forced to box, chimpanzees on skates, etc. The list goes on. These are the type of living conditions for the majority of circus animals. So these animals, these are macaques which are used in a circus in Harbin. They'll spend maybe 22, 23 hours of their day here, maybe 20 minutes performing, a little bit of time training. And these are some of the other practices, fortunately not quite as widespread, but I think they were touched on a little bit yesterday. Feeding of live animals to carnivores still happens in a number of safari parks in China. This is one of the more extreme examples of sheep which have been bought by the members of the public to be thrown into an enclosure of lions. Majority of animals are chickens, ducks, also happens with cows. And then there's this issue of people's photographic opportunities. Here in Tianjin Zoo, as a family, which is obviously, putting themselves in an incredibly dangerous position to have their photograph taken with a fully grown tiger. And then there's a general sort of housing conditions for a number of animals, incredibly barren enclosures, and also quality of life issues as well. And a number of zoos that I've visited, this one in particular, again in Tianjin, is a tiger which for some reason has some debilitating disease, partial paralysis, and is just kind of dragging itself around an enclosure with obviously nobody actually trying to address the situation or to euthanize this animal. Major issues with things like social isolation for primates, in particular for chimpanzees, which become too difficult for the keepers to manage, and so they're isolated. But also for young primates as well, which are then being used for handling and photographic opportunities. And also a major issue with the trade in wild-caught animals. Here we know of around about 150 wild-caught chimpanzees, which are now in Chinese zoos. But there's also a growing number of wild-caught African elephants, which are being traded legally. The chimpanzees being traded illegally. The wild-caught elephants traded legally. This one came out of Hwange National Park in Zimbabwe. And a number of these animals are also then going to be used to be trained within the animal performances and also within human interaction shows, such as the wild-caught beluga whales. So that's some of the problems that we see in the zoos. Let's have a look more at some of the positives in terms of how welfare is improving and what we've been doing to improve welfare. I can't name everybody here, but these are some of the organizations that over the last 4 to 5 years, Animals Asia has worked very closely with. We work very closely with Andrew and HSI on this program. but the Zoo Association in China, but also the British Zoo Association and EASA, Detroit Zoo, etc., etc. And what have we done? Well, we've had international experts such as Ron in China talking at zoo directors' conferences. These are some of the issues that we've been raising at some of these conferences. Ron was there in 2013 in Shenzhen talking about animal welfare assessment. But we've had experts talking specifically on environmental enrichment, understanding what are normal, abnormal behaviours, professional zookeeping standards, captive management of chimpanzees, they said earlier, was a major problem. We've had people there talking about the role that zoos can play in addressing the wildlife trade, and also more health and veterinary related issues such as control of infectious diseases, pain recognition and management, etc. We've held a number of specific training workshops, and these are working with active environments based here in the US, coming to China to run workshops for primate keepers, talking about behavior management. We've assisted with Detroit Zoo's workshops recently. We've just held an elephant management workshop in the only zoo in China that has a protected contact wall. Active environments, many of you may well know Margaret Whitaker. Margaret was in China. We had about 80 elephant keepers come to this training session in collaboration with the Zoo Association and with Nanjing Zoo, and learning about protected contact and foot care, etc. We've been doing a lot of work with Hilda Tres from the Phoenix Zoo on chimpanzee integrations and management. As we said earlier, one of the issues we've identified from a number of the zoo visits was the social isolation issues. So we've had Hilda in China 3 times now. She's there right now for a 4th visit, working with Changsha, Guangzhou, Chengdu, Taiyuan, Guangzhou and Fuzhou zoos, providing training for chimpanzee keepers, but also integrating individuals as well. So this one example, Changsha Zoo had 3 adult chimpanzees, all of which had been isolated and were obviously showing some abnormal behaviours. All 3 have now been integrated with each other with Hilda's help, and the male, as we're hearing, is showing much reduced stereotypy. This is just one example. All of the zoos that we've been worked with have then provided with a significant amount of advice on enrichment for chimpanzees, use of substrates, enclosure furnishings, etc. I mentioned Detroit Zoo. We were incredibly proud and honoured to have Ron out in China last year, and the spin-off from that was that Ron was invited by the Zoo Association and by the 3 key and largest zoos in China, Beijing, Shanghai and Guangzhou, to come back to carry out a welfare assessment, which I was surprised actually at how quickly that happened, because it's something which I'd wanted to see happen. I thought maybe we were looking at a few years away before it did happen. It happened earlier this year. Our support for this was really a translation support in terms of our staff actually being on the ground, helping with the logistics and helping with the translation for the guys who were out there, for Scott and for Stephanie and Ron. If we move on to Vietnam, we've only recently started our work in Vietnam and working with some of the Vietnamese zoos. We've currently held 2 Shape of Enrichment workshops. Many of you will know Val from Shape of Enrichment, which are very much aimed at practical improvements for zookeepers and how to work with commonly available tools, etc., rather than the grand scale changes. And that's already beginning to have some success in terms of improving welfare on smaller scale. And recently we've set up a more practical hands-on support within Hanoi Zoo and the Hanoi Wildlife Rescue Centre, where we've put 5 zookeepers in situ, so actually based in the zoo since April of last year. So they've been there on a voluntary basis for themselves. We've covered all their costs to be in Hanoi, and they're basically there just to provide that kind of hands-on support and guidance in terms of looking at trying to address some of the behavioural issues which are being found in Hanoi Zoo, and provide some skills training for the zookeepers, etc. We've also had quite an extensive zoo vet training program. This is in collaboration with the veterinary school in Edinburgh and the Jean Marchig International Centre for Animal Welfare Education, but also with individual zoos. Copenhagen and Edinburgh Zoo vets have been out providing training. We hold now an annual international zoo veterinary training symposium within China. This was held just in September in Changchun Zoo. This was the second one. 82 vets attending from 44 zoos, and you can see just some of the topics there. These are topics which the Zoo Association and the zoo vets come to us to say that they want some help with. So things such as sedation and anesthesia in hippos, elephants, giraffes, etc. The public awareness side of things is obviously incredibly important, especially towards ending the cruel practices that we see in some of the zoos. And we run a large campaign now working with a number of the animal protection groups, which Andrew referred to earlier in terms of the number of the rise in groups in China has been quite astronomical. We run a number of campaigns to get those groups out into schools, giving school talks, also with university students. So these are posters which are looking at showing some of the problems of using animals in performances. And we've got poster exhibitions happening now across Chinese universities. Here's some of the posters. We ran a design poster competition just 2 years ago, which received over 2,000 entries. And those posters are now going out, with the students, but also on billboards in airports and in prominent places where these animal performances are happening. And then finally, the government side and the policy side. The major aim, obviously, here was to influence the governing authorities to adopt some kind of practices and regulations. The picture here is of the Zoo Association officials, which represent the ministry in China, and some of the key zoo directors from China. Deputy Zoo Director of London Zoo, Director of Shanghai, Director of Chengdu Zoo. We had a trip for them into the UK to meet with Chester Zoo and London Zoo. I also met at Bristol Zoo, and one of the interesting things was we talked a lot about what zoo standards used to be in the UK. So this is a picture from Bristol Zoo from the late 50s, early 60s, of a gorilla, which is probably a wild-caught gorilla, which is being used obviously as a photographic opportunity, which is something which is now very common in China. And so, we would very much sort of saying, look, this is where we were a number of years ago, and this is how we want to work to try to speed things up to prevent there being another 40 or 50 years before this is outlawed within China. So to conclude some of the achievements from a policy perspective, we started our program with the China Zoo Association in 2009. By 2010, the ministry, which is responsible for the traditional zoos, brought in a ban on use of animals in performances in the traditional zoos. And this was on the back of a number of investigations and reports that we released in 2009. This was followed up a couple of years later by the CAZG, is the China Association of Zoological Gardens. They've now issued a code of ethics and animal welfare for their member institutions. And then in June 2013, the ministry have issued a national zoo development ban, which again includes the ban on the use of animals in performances within the zoos. Some of the closures of animal performances, the picture is of the toothless tiger there was at Nanjing Zoo from back in 2009. That's now gone. But you can see there's a growing list of zoos now which no longer have these animal performances. We're also seeing activists actively closing down circuses. Activists within China which shut down a circus in Wuhan just last year. And we're seeing some improvements within the zoos, and just some very, very small scale improvements, such as Changchun Zoo here now, which have got artificial termite mounds, Nanjing Zoo, which are now obviously addressing some of the elephant foot care problems, Changchun Zoo again here, which are now using substrates, enclosure furnishings, etc. In Vietnam, the bear enclosure, they had a big problem with aggression. We helped to put this platform in place, which has significantly helped to reduce aggression within the enclosure. And our program now is working on policy development in Vietnam. And just in 2 weeks' time, Scott is coming out from representing Detroit, talking with zoo directors and government officials at a forum that we've organised for the zoo directors and the government officials to talk specifically about animal welfare improvements. So just 3 very quick take-home messages. The challenges that we have are on a grand scale. There are new challenges. I mentioned briefly yesterday, we're looking now at killer whales coming into China. So we're going the opposite way for the cetaceans within China as we are maybe here in the US and within Canada. There is huge public support. This is public support for a cetacean show, but this is common for the circus performances still as well. So we've still got a big uphill challenge. But there's a real desire from within the zookeeping community to learn from the international experts that we bring into the community, into the country. We can't bring enough people in, basically, and opportunities really do exist for animal welfare focused experts such as yourselves to work alongside us to drive this process forward, to drive the process of welfare improvements forward, but also drive the process of policy development forward, both within China and within Vietnam. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Questions for Dr. Neale? Back there.
Thank you. David, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about belugas in China. I understand that's a burgeoning new trade.
Yeah, I think the records I have we have about a record of about, I think it's 100 and something, 120 belugas, which are wild caught, which are now in about 30 or 40 different facilities. Unfortunately, we're way behind the curve on this with regards to the trend. The advocacy, looking at it, should have started maybe 10 years ago. It just wasn't able to do then. There wasn't the people in place with the awareness to do it from the China side. But it's a huge industry, and that industry has gone from the dolphins into belugas, and now we're seeing it developing into the killer whales. Interestingly, we put a lot of pressure on Hong Kong Ocean Park in 2011 because they wanted the belugas, which the mainland China parks were all getting, and the pressure that they come under stopped them from bringing the belugas in. But there's still that pressure hasn't happened on the mainland yet, and it's something which needs to be addressed in terms of trying to raise the public's awareness about these issues, particularly about the wild caught issues.
We better move on, although I have this question that I really want to ask, but we don't have time, but I'll ask it anyway. What's the pros and cons of working in China, which I presume is a dictatorship, compared to working in a democracy?
You have to be incredibly careful of what you say. We run a very delicate position because we have a government agreement with the government to run a rescue centre for bears, which is part of our deal towards ending bear farming. And so whenever we start to push on some of these other issues, such as illegality of imports of chimpanzees, then we're very quickly told to be quiet, and we have to be, because otherwise we potentially lose our status within China. So that's some of the big issues. And then what we then see is we try to provide the resources for other organizations to do that work on our behalf almost, and they come under a lot of pressure from the government as well. So when the government is pushed hard enough on an issue like this, then they come out fighting, which in a certain sense is a good thing, because it means that they're very concerned about it, but they're very weighty in terms of being able to silence people, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.